Welcome. My name is President, and I am calling the meeting of the Charter Review Board to order today, Monday, June 21st at 2 o'clock p.m. Welcome to all of you. May not have known who I am. I am Eve Rosen, and I'm serving as the chair for this meeting today. If all of you would silence your phones if you have not already done so. And Town Clerk, would you call the roll?
Yes. Member Greenwald,
Present.
Member Ty,
Present.
Member Riami. Okay, he's not here. Chairperson Donaldson isn't here today. Town Attorney Tercivia, Town Manager Labadie.
Present.
Thank you.
At this point, we will stand for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. The next item on is the approval of the agenda. Are there any deletions or additions to the agenda from any of the members? If not, can we have a motion to approve the agenda?
So moved.
Those in favor?
Aye.
Okay. To the town clerk, are there any public comments?
There are no pre-registered public comments today.
Okay. Let's move on to approval of the meeting minutes. And I believe we have two sets?
You just have one.
Just one?
Yes.
Okay. The May 26th Charter Review Board minutes. There were some corrections. There are some changes. Given those changes, is there a motion for approval or any question about any additional changes? How are you? Do we have a motion for approval of the minutes? Okay. Those in favor?
Aye.
Those opposed? Okay. Now we're moving on to the continuing business of this review board, which is the discussion of the charter sections recommended. And I'm going to, I think today, given the attendance, is focus on the ones that we have not yet reached a decision as to whether we want to keep them the same or make any changes. Hello?
Can we check and see if Ron can hear us and whether he'll be able to participate as a voting member today? Because it may change what we're going to actually participate.
Hi. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hello? You can hear me?
We can hear you. Can you hear us?
Yes, I can. So, sorry, but I'm in the middle of dinner in Italy, and so I just want to make a couple of comments about the items that you're going to discuss, and that's the the one with respect to the tenure, the terms, tenure terms for the commission and mayor and so forth. I mean, I'm strongly in favor of, if possible, 3 3-year terms or 2 4-year terms, if that can work out. I'm also in favor of at least the limits that were discussed with respect to the amount of money that the commission is authorized to spend for both new projects and maintenance projects, at least 10% and 7.5% of the approved Highland Beach budget annually. And then I'm certainly in favor of having the town manager and finance managers ability to approve signed checks, not just approve, but sign checks. And those were I think those were the big items that I was focused on right at the moment. And I will be at the next meeting in July physically. And so I'll be able to participate fully then.
Ron, can you hear me?
Yes. Yes.
The first one, I'm not quite sure whether you were in favor of multiple 3-year terms or the 2 4-year terms. I didn't quite understand what you said.
What I said is either one would be acceptable to me based on, I think there's some things that Marshall, I think, may be bringing up today, according to the last meeting, about what makes sense in terms of logistics and how the terms fall and so forth, whether it makes sense to have 3 3-year terms or 2 4-year terms. But I'm in favor of the extension, whatever that would make sense for the town.
Thank you. Marshall, since your name has been taken in vain,
Yes, right.
would you care to elaborate?
So what I have provided, this sounds really good today. The charter review document that you see, and at the bottom it says revised 617. I kind of captured, I tried to capture the sense of the board or consensus of the board as it relates to each topic. So I know that we spent a lot of time discussing the terms, and moving to a 4-year term logistically seemed a little bit difficult after looking at some of the values and of keeping that term turnover at 3 years and not having to reset those items. And the thing that I saw that was still open is if we wanted to add that 3rd term to it, and then we never really came back around to the cooling off period. If that was, you get 3 3-year terms and then you got to take a year off. But naturally, I would find, depending on the position you are in, you would almost naturally have a cool off period, or you would have to resign to run if you wanted to move to a different position. So, so if your term was up, we have like this year, Commissioner David, her term is up for re-election. There's no other office being held. So if she couldn't rerun, there was no spot for her to go to. So there's some natural cooling off period or gapping in the current cycles of the commission. So saying you could go from commissioner to vice mayor to mayor back to commissioner would be a little bit challenging, because you would at some point in time have to either take a year off or 2 years off to reset to that next position, or you would have to resign your current post to go after that next position. Because if say you're in a current term and your next natural step in your progression politically would be to say go to vice mayor from commissioner, you're not on the exact same cycle as the vice mayor. Either you have to wait to get the next time it comes up, or you have to resign your current post to run. So I think that 3-year cycle, there was a lot of value to it. It's just a matter, do we want to add yet another 3rd term to that? But it was interesting that it was pointed out that we don't have any language that says you can't go through the cycle and come back and start over again either. So conceivably, you could be in office for a very long time if you use in the community like the work that you were doing.
Thank you. Do any of the participants members have a comment?
Yeah, I think that if we move to 4 year term, Probably finishing election would be a problem. I don't know whether that will fall into the regular cycle of elections or not. If it is a problem, then why should we move to 4 years? And for 2-3-year terms, if I don't know whether we should extend to the term now, 2 terms. I don't know whether it's a good idea or not. But no, personally, I feel that I don't see any problem because this is a small town and no kind of benefits for people to be there unless they are willing to serve the public service. Actually, who are willing to serve the community, run for benefits. I don't see any kind of benefits for them to try to get another term to profit for themselves.
I'm still strongly opposed to 4-year terms and in favor of 3-year terms for the more rapid potential turnover that we talked about the last time. Plus, it's less disruptive in terms of we were already on a 3-year cycle. In terms of how many consecutive terms one can serve, I can be easily swayed whether that should be 2 3-year terms or 3 3-year terms. I do think that there probably should be something in there that no one can serve more than 12 consecutive years, for example, without taking a break on the commission. Now, that could be 6 years as a commissioner and 6 years as vice chair, 6 years as mayor, but probably no more than 12 years consecutive, 1-year break. That would be my view.
Ron?
I agree with Dr. Greenwald. I'm in favor of the 3-year terms and as he suggests, some sort of language that after 12 years, you have to take a 1-year break or something. Makes sense to me.
I guess I'm having a little difficulty sort of putting that together. I think the consensus is that there would be no opposition to 3-3-year terms. What I'm hearing is beginning of a consensus that 3-year terms should continue. The issue is whether there should be, I guess, a question of either or and a off period after the end of either 2 or 3 3-year terms and a max of 12 years, or whether there should be a max of 12 years. You could change terms. So I would suggest and ask if there could be a motion, whether we could have a draft for the next meeting of both of those positions for consideration by the full board. Is there a motion that would support that?
So
I'll make that motion.
Thank you, Ron. Second? Second? Marshall?
just waiting on the chair to be recognized. What exactly are you asking?
Yeah.
To be drafted? Just so I can tell Glenn what.
I think what we're drafting is, I think we're all committed to 3-year terms. Okay, so that's first thing. The second thing is there are 2 alternates here, is whether there should be 3 3-year terms, regardless of position, and a cooling off period, or whether there could be 2 sets of 3-year terms or 1 set of 3 years times 3 plus 1 at a different position. But after 12 years, it would have to be cooling off regardless of the number of positions held by an individual.
So it's either, everybody agrees on 3-year terms. 3 3-year terms. I heard that as one option. And regardless of position, then 1 year cooling off period at the end of 9 years.
Or,
Or
well, I think that's 3 3-year terms or up to 12 years regardless of position. So in theory, Glenn, you could have 3 3-year terms as vice commissioner and 1 3-year term as commissioner. But that would be 12 years and you'd have to have a break.
And that would also, for example, allow, I'm thinking of different scenarios that could come up, someone to serve 2 years and then run for a different position, receive that position for 3 years. But as long as the total is 12 years.
Correct.
Doesn't matter. And they could stay 12 years in the same position, right? The 12 years doesn't seem to matter what position. You can move around to 5 different positions or you can stay in the same position. Is that correct for the second alternative?
I think that's the second alternative.
Yeah, the only trouble I see with that is conceivably you would have somebody who was a highly regarded commissioner for 9 years and then decided to run for mayor, in which case that individual could only be mayor for 1 term and then gone. It would be a
With
3-year
a
mayor.
cooling off period.
Well, yes, but he or she would have to discontinue. I don't know whether that's something that's strong enough an argument to mitigate what we're talking about, but it is something that should be considered. I mean, the potential progression of somebody like serving 2 terms as a commissioner and then potentially becoming mayor for 2 terms is like attractive to me. So to sort of rule that out of the gate kind of thing, I mean, it doesn't rule it out. They could still do that, but I don't know.
I see a question regarding this one, cooling off a year. And then how can that person come back to serve the commission? Because a 3 years, 3-year term. So election, how can that person come back after a year cooling off?
You wouldn't you wouldn't have the same position, but you could run for another spot on the commission.
They do overlap, so every year we have an election.
Every year there's an election.
Every year we have at least one
With a
commissioner.
3-year cycle, every year there's 1 and
The 1 year
2
there's
out of the
2.
3 years, there's 2.
Mhm.
So that, but you're correct. I mean, if your term as mayor was up, you could take a year off, but you couldn't, and come back to the commission, but you couldn't come back as mayor for 3 years. Because that would be the next time that office was up for election. But that part I find to be satisfactory. That's okay. To me, this is one of those where I think everybody's going to have there's no like exact right answer to this.
With that said, Marshall and Glenn, do you have enough of an understanding to draft the possibilities for us to review for the next meeting?
Yes. Yes,
Yes, Glenn does.
yes, I do.
So Vice Chair,
Excellent news.
so Vice Chair Rosen, just for the record, the motion is for town attorney and town managers to draft some language to bring back at the next meeting.
That's correct.
Okay, I just wanted to clarify that. Thank you.
Okay. Moving on to, I think the next one where there was some interest in changing the language was section 2.019. If any of you think that I've skipped something that I think we've already agreed on, please let me know. 2.019. That's the fire and rescue protection provision.
Just one question before we get there. This is just for Glenn. I think I might have seen the answer to this somewhere, but I couldn't find it again. In section 107, it's about the only place where the word should is used as opposed to shall, where it says the commission should hold at least one regular meeting each month. We really mean that to be shall, is that correct? I mean, or it should have the same legal meaning as shall. It doesn't, does it?
It does not, and you're correct. So I am not sure why the word should was used there. It would seem to almost be a nod to the concept that sometimes in the summer it might be difficult to get a quorum, so that it's not mandatory in the event that we just can't get a quorum in July. But that's it. That's pure speculation on my part.
But I believe we've set a resolution that says at least one, there's an ordinance, I think. It's the ordinance part, maybe.
I think you're right. I mean, I think the
We
commission-
said you have to have at least one meeting a month. We said
think I
shall
saw
in
it somewhere,
a
but-
ordinance. Yeah.
But in reviewing this, I couldn't find it anyplace. So
Yeah. So
if it's there, then fine. But otherwise, this language sticks out as being different than, I'm not a lawyer.
So-
no, correct. I'll have Linelda for the next meeting. She'll just email you all. We did do, I think we did an ordinance more so than a resolution as it relates to meeting. And we said that you shall meet by ordinance once a month at the first Tuesday. The second meeting is optional at the commissioner's discretion.
I
Or
think you're correct. I think
either
you're right.
discretionary, myself, if there just isn't enough people, or business, we could cancel the second, but we can't cancel the first. So we've corrected that through ordinance, but not in the charter itself.
The real question is that, I think you're right. I think it was in the charter to avoid the possibility of a lack of quorum in the summer. If that would turn out to be a problem, revising an ordinance would be easier
Mhm.
than revising the charter before the end of the 10-year period.
Yes.
Correct.
With that in mind, I would just ask, as long as we are getting that email, that we make a note to consider whether that's something where the flexibility remains in the charter, but perhaps not in the ordinance, and is that something that the board here wishes to retain?
Seems fair enough. Yep. And then Aldo will get that out. Yep. Right. Okay, cool. Thank you.
I would like to raise a question. You know, in the terms of interlocal agreement, is there any cost linked to it? If there is any kind of cost linked to it, and if the cost is over a certain percentage of the budget, should we go to the commission for, or the voter for approval or not?
I think that's where the conversation ended last time. Chair Rosen may correct me, but I think that was I think you're the one that asked for, give me some samples. What are we talking about as far
Right.
as what kind of, and you could see we have some very simple ones, but we also have some very large scale interlocal agreements that kind of affect our business, from sewage disposal, fire services, dispatch services. We have bulk water, which are relatively simple, straightforward ones, but have some large scale implications if we ever had an emergency event. So it's tricky on how do you establish that threshold of yay or nay with that. I think that's where you guys kind of left that conversation off, is how do you establish that either monetary threshold or scale or scope or type. But I thought you guys started talking about that 4/5 like super majority to do it. So there is the chance that a couple commissioners that didn't like it could hold it back until a proper agreement was drafted or the like. Might be kind of that middle groundish, if you will. Because after that, I reflected on it. It's kind of true. Like if we had to go to the voters and they said no per se to sewage disposal, we're in a spot. So we got to be kind of careful.
There, I don't want us to conflate two separate, what I regard as two separate issues. One is the issue of the ability of the commission to outsource what I would call essential services, like police, fire, water, sewage, whatever, or anything else deemed essential. And then that's one issue to me. And then the second issue is the whole financial issue, which is another big issue, which is how much they can spend. But the two obviously intersect, but I mean, whatever it costs, we've sort of discussed that the town wouldn't be allowed to contract with the Sheriff's Department of Palm Beach County for police services unless there was some referendum saying that we didn't want to support our own police department anymore. And we talked about for fire, although we're going in the opposite direction with that one. And then some of us brought up, well, what about water? Isn't that essential? What about sewage? Isn't that essential? I regard trash as essential, but that we already have an external contract for trash that I think everybody's happy with. So we have to come up with the wording and everything for that, which is the interlocal agreement authority. And then there's a separate argument that we have to come up with, which is the financial end, whether that's going to be an absolute number or a percentage, as Ron was talking about, whether it's going to be a simple majority, a supermajority, a majority plus one of the financial advisory board, and or going to referendum, and where to draw those lines. That's a separate, also complicated issue, more complicated issue.
I'm so glad you brought that up. The question that I was considering, and I don't have a legal answer to, is entering into an interlocal agreement a project for which there is a funding limitation? Or are the interlocal agreements not considered projects, in which case Dr. Greenwald's comments about cost are something that need to be considered? I'm not trying to muck this up. I'm trying to figure out how this works, especially given the discussion about police and fire versus some of the other agreements that already exist or may exist in the future. I'll take input from lawyers.
Well, the funding limitation, when you read that, it kind of stands alone. Just any single project or accumulation of projects. And it doesn't say,
Or the expansion of
or
services.
the expansion of
fits
services.
into the funding.
But it doesn't say except for interlocals or, except for anything else. So arguably, it all falls in that ambit, and it might not be appropriate, but I feel compelled to ask the question, why single out interlocal agreements from any other agreement? I mean, the town does dozens of agreements every year, and I'm going to guess we probably have at least a half a dozen in any given year with other governments for anything from small projects to big projects. And if the town's receiving a grant, for example, and the granting agency from the state says, we have to sign an agreement. Well, now you had an interlocal agreement. So now we have to,
True.
there's so much intersection where a town interacts with other government agencies, special districts, counties, other cities.
FP&L.
F,
Yeah, FP&L requires an interlocal to backstop the streetlights agreements and stuff. Yeah.
So,
about those,
yeah,
yeah.
I almost think that this is an area where there's a lot of unimagined potential issues. So I kind of question why single out that category of agreements as opposed to saying all agreements with dog catchers or all agreements with trash picker-uppers.
Well, is there some other
Reason?
phraseology that we can use? I mean, primarily outsourcing, is that better than interlocal agreements? In other words,
Not really.
I think some people would like to see some protection against three commissioners deciding as a simple majority that we're signing a contract with whoever it is, the sheriff's department or Boca Raton to provide police services.
Oh, yes, I think there is language you can come up with. I mean, again, points
So-
of both Palm Springs and Ocean Ridge have
So,
recently.
so what we would want would be some sort of language, and again, I'm not sure legally how you phrase it, that would prevent the outsourcing, well, if that's a bad word, I don't know what the right word is, but basically giving up the primary responsibility for those services to other communities, or I suppose, private enterprise, without a referendum. Those services to include police, fire rescue, water, and sewer would be my top four. Somebody might think of other ones. Somebody might think that's too restrictive. But I think that was the general idea, was just that, as you know, because other towns have done it, some have been happy with it, some have lived to regret it, but by charter, as opposed to just the good sense of the commission, potentially by a 3-2 vote, doing away with some of these internal services that I think many people in the town regard as being something that makes us somewhat of a unique community. So I don't know the best way to achieve that language, but I think something like that needs to be considered if it's doable.
So we could, since Glenn's going to be playing Scrivener here, come up with language where those types of services would be protected from, I guess we'll come up with the word for outsourcing, but it seems to be the right moment. But then it would either require a referendum under one scenario or 4/5 majority commission on the other one. So as we continue the discussion, we could see which one seems to be more palatable as we reflect on that language a bit to see, do we really want to take that completely away from the commission, the ability to do some level of it, or do we want it always to be with the voters to make a change?
Yeah, and I think we have to recognize that, sure, we're going to have interlocal agreements so that, you know, if we need a SWAT team, somebody is going to show up. If, you know, or for fire, the supplemental exchanges that go on. I don't know how much, you know, those kinds of agreements. And we already have, one would argue, certainly, while we have our own drainage system, the sewage processing is already contracted with Delray, for example. So somehow or other, that would have to be grandfathered in. But so I don't know what the language should be, but I know what I think some of us at least would like to see the intent would be.
Let me try asking this. In the charter right now, there are a lot of enumerated functions that are strictly within the discretion of the commission. The question, I think, arises as to whether entry into intralocal agreements, and just to reflect, we've been talking about sheriffs and police as the big risk factor the last two meetings, which led into a discussion of other intralocal agreements. And the question is whether there should be a division, I think, in terms of the continuing discretion of the commission with respect to an awful lot of the agreements that we enter into on a very regular basis, as opposed to some that maybe have a super, I'll call it a super priority or a super concern of the town. So for instance, police, fire, rescue, and maybe water. And whether we should remove those from the enumeration of the straight discretion of the board the straight discretion of the commission to enter into those agreements and segregate. I'll use those four for right now because it seems to be those that are the subject of the most discussion, but I guess it could be some others in there. Whether we create a separate section that creates the need for either a supermajority or a referendum in order to enter into those types of agreements. Glenn?
So building off of what you both just said, Dr. Greenwald and yourself, keep hearing the expression essential services. So one way to do it is to create a charter provision that defines essential services as those four items. go back to saying avoid interlocal, because water, for example, there are private water providers out there. So you could have a private company privatize your water.
Right.
When the commission was looking at fire rescue, we actually did spend time looking at private companies. And we found that that really was a non-starter, but who knows what the future may bring. There are parts of the country where there are private providers. So something along the lines that says essential services, as hereinafter defined, those big four I'll start with, shall not be outsourced, contracted away, whatever the word is, unless there's either a referendum of the people or four-fifth commission. That's kind of the sense. Dr. Greenwald, Chair,
Yeah, that's the sense, although I would prefer it to be a referendum rather than even four-fifths of the commission for
Okay.
that one. For the financial component, I'm not adverse to a tiered system with four-fifths of the commission, but outsourcing of the police department, I would prefer that went to a referendum rather than four-fifths of the commission.
Yeah, I agree with that. I agree with the outsourcing. But when we talk about the intergovernment arrangement, it is a little bit difficult, different. When we decide to privatize a function like a fire or something like that, a company, according to some studies out there, some companies try to get it at first for a few years at low cost. And when they see that the government get it off their department, no more equipment, no thing there, they raise, the price up. And then at the time, the government already liquidated all equipment, all the fire department first of all. And then we have some kind of problem. Therefore, I would suggest that for intergovernment agreements, I think we should not have voters' approval. But for privatization, when we get rid of it, deal with the private sector, there may be some kind of interest from some commissioners or something like that, like, to protect that case, the voters should be involved. So I would like to repeat what I suggest. For intergovernment agreement, the commission and the town manager will be able to make decisions at their discretion. For major decision like a privatization, absolutely, I prefer to have voters' involvement.
So to summarize, if I'm understanding, we have the division, if you will, of the core major services, which may be subject to some higher sense of review than just the general majority vote of the commission. And then secondarily, whether it's the four major or any other intralocal agreement, the suggestion is that if there's going to be a vote on privatization as opposed to an intralocal governmental agreement, that there be consideration of whether that should be a supermajority or a referendum. Is that a fair summary of what I've heard?
I guess that's what we've heard. I mean, personally, I don't see the real distinction between outsourcing to another government versus private in terms of what kind of votes we have to take. So again, to me, it's just if the town isn't going to be having primary responsibility of running it, basically, meaning we're going to outsource it to somebody, whether it's another government or a private entity, when that happens, there should be approval by a referendum.
With that in mind, and subject to the fact that we're not a full commission board, I'm sorry, we're not a full board today. I keep confusing those. If we could keep both of those, Dr. Greenwald, and then continue the discussion
Of course.
based on both possibilities. So when we have a full contingent, we can discuss that. Marshall, you're looking at me like I'm,
No, I'm thinking it through because I'm going to ask Glenn to draft maybe some sample language around that concept of essential services. And again, the trick I think I see from managerial perspective is smaller arrangements or agreements. Yes, we are primarily responsible, but we can't do everything. So we'll have these secondary agreements. So I think we have to have some language that recognizes as the primary provider of the service. If you have to have mutual aid and support services, those can be done by the commission as necessary, but the primary responsibility has to be with town forces, if you will, to do that without voter referendum to change that, or 4/5 supermajority.
Yeah, I think we're on the same page as to what we'd like. I think the language is going to be the issue in coming up with something that everybody can really understand so that we don't create unnecessary hindrances, as an unintended consequence of what we're recommending.
And just two theoretical questions. One on the referendum 4/5 majority. Right now, we're talking about them as either or. Any interest in having them combined? That you couldn't outsource these unless you had both a 4/5 majority and a referendum. Now, that's really strict and tying hands. I didn't think so. I see you shaking your head no, but I also heard Dr. Greenwald
No, I
trying to be very strict.
I don't think so either. I think once
Okay.
you go to a referendum, that takes precedence.
And then my second question is the essential services. Do you want to keep those grouped together, which I'm hearing, as opposed to 4 separate votes, people to vote, police on this ballot, police, fire, water, sewer, 4 separate yes votes, or encompass them all into one essential service category, which is what the conversation has been, but you all haven't talked about whether you want to break them into different component pieces.
well, that's going to create a drafting dilemma, I think.
I'm not advocating it, believe me.
No.
I'm not
I
advocating
think
it at
my
all.
point is that you could have one come up as we are facing today with fire. And let's just say that the charter then said this had to go to referendum. Let's just hypothetically assume that. You wouldn't want to have to vote at the same time on all of the other, I'll call them essential services, because there's really nothing to select. In other words, the contracts are in place, the agreements are in place. There's no change in process. So I think what the drafting has to address is for those essential services, if there's for lack of a better description right now, a major shift in process proposed.
No, I think well, I don't want to speak for Glenn, but I think what you're asking is should they be on the referendum ballot, whether they should be listed as 4 separate entities so that if people are really opposed to outsourcing the police and fire, they can just vote for those. And if they don't really care that much about water and whatever our 4th one was, they could vote independently basically on those rather than lumping the 4 of them together, which becomes more a political decision, I think, than a content decision. But it's a valid point, obviously.
I guess my concern is if there's no controversy, if there's no issue, if there's no case with respect to water or with respect to police at the same time that there's a discussion of fire, I don't know why one would put all of them on one ballot when there's really no disagreement about them. I think what you're suggesting is that because we're facing this issue with fire, should we have a referendum that talks about all of the essential services? From drafting a charter, would that mean that 3 years from now, if there was a movement to move the police department to the local sheriffs, that you would then have to vote on all 4 again? I think that's what's giving me a little bit of concern about how we draft this notion.
I think the goal would be to write it so that it limits the powers of the commission in those 4 areas, basically. I mean, that's what the change would be. And if it was decided that maybe we wanted to move, again, for illustration purposes, the police, then that referendum at that point would just be on moving the police. It wouldn't affect the other quote unquote essentials that were in the charter.
Question I might have, Glenn, is if, because I'm just trying to think in a labor negotiation scenario, that if all of a sudden you are required to provide it with your own forces, you don't have any leverage if it gets out of hand at some point in time, right? So if it's a 4/5 majority, the commission could see that, hey, they're not being cooperative. We're going to have to go a different direction just because of labor cost and the like. I'm just saying on the other side of the coin here. Could you have language in there that gives a certain period of time before the decision could be made for filing of a referendum by voters to freeze a decision before it's executed? So if a commission says we're going to outsource all police services and they move through 4/5 and say that decision is not effective for a 90-day period to give time for voters to file a referendum against that decision and then force it back to the ballot. I don't know if that's a possibility or too complex. It just might be too complex. Okay.
If I understand what you're saying, Marshall, is if 4/5 of the commission decided to, let's use that word outsource again, one of those 4 essential services, that wouldn't be effective for some period of time, so that if the people wanted a referendum on it, they could call for one.
Yep.
Establish a process. Within so many days, you get 10% of the voters sign a petition or whatever the numbers are. And then there could be a referendum to overrule that decision.
Mm-hmm.
So it's almost like a veto power.
Yep, like a backstop. Yep.
Any other comments? Okay, I think we've now talked about drafting 3 possibilities. And Glenn, I'm going to ask for a little help from you, but I think what we've talked about is whether for essential services, whatever those may be, and I'll use that term for lack of going through an enumeration at this point, we either go with a straight 4/5 majority, we go through an automatic need for a referendum, or we go through the hybrid version of a supermajority with a holding period and the opportunity for the voters to petition for a referendum.
Yes, that's what I've heard.
Is that fair?
Yeah.
Do I have a motion to approve the drafting of those things?
So moved.
Second.
Okay. All right, the next one, equally interesting, is the funding limitations. Now, this is separate from what we've just discussed. And the issue is whether there should be an increase in the discretionary funding, or I'll call it, that would be inappropriate, whether the funding authority of the commission should be greater than $350,000, and if so, for what purposes? And there has been the suggestion that maintenance could be limited to no more than 10% of the combined operating and enterprise fund budgets, and any other project would be limited to no more than 7.5%, including the expansion of town services.
Yeah.
Okay.
I have comments on the first one, and I don't see any problem. But the second one, it's tricky. Only limited to 7.5%. All the town projects. What are the other town projects I think the new capital improvement projects or something like that. Marshall, can you explain a little bit?
Yeah, so a maintenance project would be, think of our sanitary sewer lining project, that's $1.1 million. That the lines are in the ground, we have to maintain the system, a water plant, water treatment plant, something goes that keeps us from maintaining the ability to treat the water. Whatever those are is 10%, and whatever that cost is, we can go ahead and do that, or the commission basically can go ahead and do that. 7.5% would be some other type of project. Signs, new park, something that isn't something that we have in the ground that we wanted to do. Whatever it is that doesn't exist, anything new from scratch, a program, a volleyball team, pickleball courts. I mean, if we wanted to do something that we don't have, it would be capped at 7.5%. And I think this would, if we decided to do something outside of maintaining a facility that we had, we wanted to put in pocket parks along the sidewalk, a series of pocket parks, and it costs more than 7.5%, you would need a voter referendum. So again, the majority of our concerns, as you would see here, maybe a ladder truck, right? So something needs to be replaced at some point in time. I wouldn't think that if I needed a new transmission that I would have to come and get a voter referendum to fix the transmission, but to get a new one, then that our current limitations would be quite constrained, would really constrain our ability to maintain the fire department. So I put a list of some typical projects that we know we will need or have had a need for here. You could see, a fire engine ladder truck could be up to $1 million. A fire rescue vehicle, $450,000. Just to resurface our streets, it's $500,000. That's just resurfacing, not going down and doing a complete rehabilitation of the road. You could probably add a factor of 10 if we have to take it all the way out and redo base material. That's just milling and filling. We have some roofs coming up that I guess I'm gonna have to ask the voters for a new roof for Public Works in the library building when those go bad in the next couple of years under the current scenario. So I think everyone has begun to recognize that 350 is an outdated number. Where do we get to that? So I put in some typical projects. I got Matt here. He has maybe an idea that might work somewhere in between with these numbers, but he's here if you have any financial questions as it relates to this. So it's really kind of to you all, but that, maintenance projects, anything that's in place, working and in ground, anything new, like we needed to do an addition to the fire station, that's a new project. You're not maintaining the existing building, you're making a new footprint. That would be considered a new project.
Yeah, thank you very much for your explanation. Through that, I have observation. Normally, measure capital investment. First of all, in this case, roof replacement may cost a lot. We cannot consider it as a kind of maintenance. We may think of a kind of capital budgeting. That means in the government, there are two types of financing. We use the current revenues to fund regular operating budget. But for major projects, normally local governments use debt financing. And in the case of debt financing, I don't know how much debt this house has incurred. But we have, normally we should set a kind of debt limit related to the so-called assessed value of properties. First, in that case, I suggest that we give flexibility to the government to invest in capital funding, capital projects. Therefore, 7.5% is really, I don't know how the town manager and the town commission can handle that kind of major project. Therefore, I would suggest that capital projects, new projects, should be under the kind of limit, debt limit of 65% first one of total assessed value of the town. In the in Europe possible. Normally, the EOCD set a kind of debt limit standard. Certain countries cannot spend more than 100% of GDP. US now spend more than the debt ratio is more than 100%. So in that case, for the fiscal, strength or health of government, and at the same time to give the government more flexibility in spending in capital projects, I suggest that we can set a kind of debt limit of 50% because we are rich. This house is rich. 50% or something like that. We can establish a kind of debt limit in relation to the total asset value of properties in the town.
This is probably the area where I have the least educated opinion. I mean, I don't know what to do with this. I know that we need to liberalize things, but I don't know what the best formula is, and I'm going to ask Matt in a minute, but I still have some fundamental questions about how the splitting up of maintenance and new projects. I mean, I get the idea. I understand that. It makes a certain amount of sense to me. Some of the stuff I still would need answers to. So again, this is a total hypothetical and would be under the current rules. The town commission decides that it would be a great idea to have, let's say, $2 million project to put in little pocket parks and improve the walkways along A1A. They decided they're going to do that by spending $350,000 a year for 6 years, which comes out to $2 million and change. Is that okay, the way things are written now? It's not okay. I mean, I know there was some questions about that even with the relining of sewer pipes, which it would seem to me that's one of those where, and I don't know operationally whether it's really more efficient or not, but what it would seem like you wouldn't necessarily really want to spread that over 3 years. You'd want to hire a company and say, hey, go get this done. And presumably the quicker they could knock it out, it might actually decrease the total charges for the project. So I don't want to be creating rules that are going to invite an endless series of, I don't know, end runs, basically. And I don't know what the best way to word things are to avoid that sort of thing. I mean, we almost ran into the same thing with the Crosswalks project. Same idea. Just some of that just doesn't make sense to me at some point. But I don't know what the best language is for it. And similarly with separating out, I can think of scenarios to get around the new fire truck business for $1 million. Well, we're going to buy a new transmission for $150,000 this year and a new engine for $300,000 next year. But we're not getting a new fire truck. We're, and then 50 grand to paint the thing or update the equipment or whatever it is. Whereas, we'd be better off just getting a new fire truck. And I don't know what the best wording is. I mean, when I read charters of other towns, I think Glenn had alluded to this at a different meeting. I mean, you really can't find much in the way of restrictions on spending other than if you can have a bond issue, which you need to for pretty much anything that's a decent sized capital project, that has to go to referendum anyway. The commission under our current charter can't just issue $10 million worth of bonds or something. So we need to liberalize this. I'm not sure what the best way is. I'm still scared enough after the last referendum thing where the commission by a 3-2 vote was very close to passing a $40 million project, that we need safeguards, but I'm at a loss to exactly how to draft that and need help. So with that segue, maybe Matt, you could tell us what you think.
Good afternoon. Yeah, I think there's at least a few different considerations. One, obviously, you have to make a distinction between operating expenses and capital expenses. Police operations versus major capital projects. I think it's also important to avoid a threshold that really impairs the town commission's ability to recover from events such as a hurricane. And that's why it sort of leads to this suggestion is that if you're looking for a dollar threshold, you might tie it to the dollar threshold identified in the town's fund balance policy that sets aside 1/12 of the general fund budget for purposes of a disaster recovery fund. It's a reservation, it's a designation within our fund balance policy to identify that for that specific purpose. And if the town finds itself in a situation to recover from a major hurricane, they will easily use that amount of money and more. And you may have a contract for debris removal that could equal that 1/12 of the budget easily if there's a disastrous situation. And for the current year budget, that would be roughly $1 million based on the proposed budget that's going to be recommended for fiscal year 22. That would be about $1.1 million. So it's just a way of tying almost a worst case scenario to a spending threshold.
It was my impression reading the charter, though, that these emergency situations are different than what we're talking about, and that the commission already has discretion during a quote emergency. And I guess you could get into how do you exactly define that and so on, but that the commission already has the discretion to spend money to fix things in the event of an emergency. Isn't that correct?
It does say that an exception would be a natural catastrophe defined as a sudden and extraordinary misfortune, unforeseen mischance, bringing with it the destruction of life and or property, as well as a litigation settlement. They threw that in there at the end, this litigation settlement.
Well, but certainly that description in the current wording would include a hurricane.
But I think what Matt's point was, and I haven't spoken to Matt, so hopefully I didn't misunderstand you, Matt, is that if you set a funding limitation of 1/12 of I think he was using that as an analogy or an example that we set aside 1/12 of the budget for this, should the funding limitation be 1/12 of the annual budget? Is that what you were
Yeah,
getting at?
that's just sort of, not that they're directly tied together. But it
Okay,
is a
my
way of-
apologies.
a reasonable number based on the fund balance policy.
And if I could, being a very simple guy, 1/12 to do that math in my head, 10% would be, what would 1/12 be, 9% or something like that of the budget?
1/12 is about 8.3%.
8.3. So I guess my question to the group then, from putting on the ballot question, is it better to do a 1/12 or a simple 10% number? It's always easy to calculate 10% for simple people like me who aren't math majors. And that would coincidentally give the town a little teeny bit more flexibility. 10% might give you an extra couple $100,000 from the 1.1 to maybe 1.2 and change. So, and I won't hide the fact that I am not a fan of the funding limitation in the sense that you see how it's tied to the town's hands, whether it's a sidewalk project, a sewer project, a street crossing project. And I think the only one that we found where there's any kind of limitation is the Palm Beach model, which is such a high limitation. It's no limitation at all. And I respect what Dr. Greenwald just said. After the referendum of a couple of years ago, I'd be hesitant to suggest abolish it completely, but somewhere where the town has this flexibility, and looking at Marshall's list, $1.1 million for sanitary sewer, that 1/12 would just squeak by depending on how it was. million for a ladder truck. You're just about getting there. So again, not my role to say a percentage, but I kind of encourage a little bit higher, maybe that 10% to give the town a little more flexibility.
So,
Actually, I wouldn't want to have any percentage at all in the audit, the charter, because we have the balanced budget requirement, right? Balanced budget requirement. Annually, you have a budget approved by the commission. And the town manager and the commission have the authority to spend, within that budget limit. The town is not allowed to overspend because that is the budget balance requirement. Therefore, I don't see any kind of, setting a limit on maintenance that give the town flexibility to manage the government.
It sounds like we still have some ongoing questions about this. I would ask, as I'm not sure we're going to get any further on this, Matt, I think you're suggesting a really good idea. The issue that I'm hearing is whether it's 1/12 or whether it's 10%.
Well, whatever percentage is sort of finally determined, by having it as a percentage of the general fund budget, you have some automatic indexing which would occur as there's just sort of natural growth over time of the budget. That threshold would naturally increase correspondingly.
But again, the issue is defining the scope of a project to which I'll use the 10% as an easy number to use, is to define the scope of the project, if you will, whether it's operational or otherwise, to address the concern that I've heard about breaking projects up into pieces and then trying to avoid the limitation. The pocket park is a really good example. Is it 10 pocket parks? Are they 10 projects? Or is it 10 pocket parks or one project? And I'm not trying to be cute here. I'm just trying to understand if we're going to have a limitation, that we have a limitation that's realistic. I think your point about letting the commission have some authority to do what is necessary is a very good point. On the other hand, I do remember the referendum, and I think that somewhere in between, we need to have a solution that addresses workable limitations on the authority of the commission, but also allows for necessary changes, improvements, repairs. Your point about the roofs should not be subject, in my mind, to a referendum, even if it's going to cost more than $350,000. So for me, the issue is how do we define projects, if you will, and then assign a limitation that doesn't unnecessarily tie the hands of the commission and their discretion to do what is necessary to run the town.
So in this case, I would like to suggest two motions here. One, get rid of the current section 201, funding limitation. The second motion is 10% or whatever there we decide. But I would suggest that we work out on something about major capital investment. I don't want to see the government make a decision to have a kind of debt, accumulate debt total, exceed certain level of the financing capacity of the government. So I would suggest, one, more section in the charter about our concern with the debt limit, not too much, just that.
Go ahead.
Just so I'm getting this straight, Matt? What you're talking about as a suggestion would be, and I'll say 10% arbitrarily at this point, but 10% of the budget essentially would be the maximum for any single line item, whether it be for maintenance or capital, prior to a referendum. The capital part, we haven't really discussed in terms of whether it's a whole capital, we haven't discussed, but we haven't decided whether it's a whole capital project or whether it could be a capital project split out over multiple years at $1 million a year or 10% a year. And if we went to that system, which would be not fully liberating, but clearly a lot more liberating for the commission than our current system, our checks and balances on that were, one, that we would need a balanced budget. Two, that they're limited in terms of how much they can raise the tax millage at any, to a certain level by charter. And three, that anytime they need to issue bonds, which presumably they would to balance the budget for large capital expenses, that has to go to a referendum. Is that correct? That's what our checks and balances.
Yeah, yes, and for the town's finances, it's better for those larger capital projects to go to referendum, because if you're going to be debt financing to be able to demonstrate that you have voter approval of that, you can basically at that point pledge the general obligation pledge of the town, which is going to be the best financing costs. Even if you don't use that particular revenue source to pay the debt, you could have voter approval for a very large water capital project. And you may end up using water and sewer revenues as the payback method, but you would be able to pledge ad valorem, which would lead to better borrowing rates.
Right. So I think I could go for something like that if we get, or I get better definition in terms of staging of projects and how all of, both maintenance for big items such as the sewer relining, which was actually might be borderline for even 10% of the budget. And therefore was split into 3 years, but is really like a project to me. That and same goes for other, more clearly definable capital type projects. How that works and whether if it's 10% a year, that's okay, no referendum, or whether if the total cost of something is going to be well over the 10%, but spread over a few years, it requires a referendum. Just so that there's clarity as to what we'd actually be recommending. I think that the direction you're talking about, and I think Ron Riami actually was talking about this for a couple of meetings, similar ideas, makes sense.
One other distinction you might want to add is whether it be local sources, which would be local tax dollars, versus grant funds that may be coming from state or federal sources. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense to restrict the commission in being able to spend dollars that are being granted to the town. So if we're able to get large sums of money from the federal government for COVID recovery or whatever they're handing it out for, and we're able to get close to $1 million from a federal source for something like our sewer projects, it doesn't make a lot of sense to have that $350,000 threshold when it's not a local source of funding.
I mean, I would be in favor again of whether we get grants from the federal government, state government, or private individuals for that matter who want to donate to certain projects. That could probably be deducted from the cost of the project that the town was responsible for. The problem I see with that, and we've seen this in the past already, is we may get promised certain grant funds and then they either don't appear or they don't appear in a timely fashion to match up with the budget, et cetera, et cetera. So that can be a little more difficult than it might first appear as well. Because again, we might not want to hold up certain things because we think, oh, it's going to be a good year in Tallahassee and maybe we'll be forthcoming, or maybe the feds are going to send us something this year, because a lot of times that may or may not pan out better or worse than we prophesy originally.
Yeah, I would like to have this question. You know, you talk about spending on something about in 3 years. That means every year you spend, money on a portion of the project. I don't know whether that is possible regarding implementation, because sometimes, for a project you have to spend upfront. Do you mean that the town should set a kind of reserve fund possible if you have a roof replacement, instead of going out to borrow the money, issue bonds, which is expensive? So for our fiscal conservative, view, just set aside
Well,
every year a
I mean,
kind of fund for the roof
Fortunately,
replacement.
our town has a big reserve. I mean, our reserve is what, 52% of the budget now, or some number in that ballpark?
We're in
So
good shape. We'll talk
We're-
about that tomorrow. So hopefully everyone turns in at noon for our budget presentation. We're in great shape. I think Dr. Ty was talking about like a sinking fund, establishing a sinking fund where you could say, we got these projects, we establish it and just keep on moving money until we get to that number. Or, we're going to need a fire truck in 10 years. Every year, we're going to put in $100,000 into a sinking fund. So when it does need to be replaced, we have that cash kind of lined up and set aside for it.
Which leads me to a question. I know that the budget's in great shape right now, but we all know that things could change. If, heaven forbid, there's an emergency here or a natural disaster, reserves would be used rather quickly.
Burst in my bubble before I made the presentation
I'm
tomorrow.
But I do have a question, and Marshall, I don't know whether it's you or Matt, but you were talking about debt and floating debt and sinking bonds. And I guess the question is whether maybe as part of this expenditure, we put a limitation on the amount of debt that can be undertaken without either a supermajority or a referendum. So that thinking about the referendum of a couple of years ago, okay? Whether that could have been accomplished over time at 10%, and I realize that's sort of a crazy hypothetical at this point, but bear with me. If there was a project where the commission agreed to assume debt or went out to seek debt, should we have a limitation before there needs to be a referendum? Should we have a provision for a sinking fund that has to be used first? What I'm trying to imagine is that there are circumstances that we may have to address going forward that are larger than the 10% and necessary. And the question is, without tying the hands of the commission, but at the same time having an upper level control of what can be done within the commission's discretion, is there something that we can carve out that addresses many of the concerns that I'm hearing right now from the discussion that's been ongoing? So could we have a tier? Could we have the 10%, not a problem within the discretion? If a project requires capital project, let's use capital because I think maintenance is, but a capital project that requires more than 10%, might we set up your sinking fund? Might we say, okay, let's devote a portion of our budget into a sinking fund for an excess of 10% that can be used by the commission with perhaps a supermajority? And then if that is, heaven forbid, not enough, if we're going to do debt, could we have a sort of a percentage where the debt could be done without a referendum versus what would be done with a referendum? I'm not trying to make this too complicated. What I'm trying to get to are the concerns that I'm hearing about discretion on one hand and limitations on the other.
Okay. You know, actually, this is the area of my teaching and my research, public budgeting and financial management. Normally, you know, I consider new project, big project in the government, like our investment in buying a house. Should we save money, set aside, wait until we have enough money to buy the house? Or should we go for mortgage or government debt to fund it and we pay gradually in the future? So that is a question for us to mention. That's why the government issue bonds normally for a major capital project, like we go to the bank for home mortgage, because there are a lot of benefits out of that. And more than that, when the government issue a municipal bond, the interest rate is very low, lower than the commercial, you know, loan. Therefore, borrowing is really good in many cases. I suggest that the charter should not put a kind of limit on borrowing.
A couple different things. I think anytime you're getting over that 10% threshold that you're going to consider debt financing, I think it would make sense to probably have a referendum associated with it, just because being able to demonstrate that voter approval increases the credit worthiness of the project and of the associated financing. Another consideration is an overall debt limit for the town. That's sort of a whole nother thing above and beyond the spending threshold. Those types of thresholds for overall debt tend to be a pretty sizable number till you start, once you get to the point where rating agencies are really going to have a concern. The number that I'm thinking of off the top of my head would be about 5% of the assessed taxable value, which is a very large number for the town, and you know, be a tremendous increase. It'd be almost a tenfold increase in the amount of debt the town has outstanding right now, which obviously we wouldn't want to consider in one bite, but it is something that over time we may grow to. But I don't think we'd even get anywhere near that 5% of assessed value threshold that is sort of a rule of thumb for rating agencies. But as I said, once you start getting over that 10% threshold, it probably is in the town's interest to have a referendum for any associated financing.
Thank you. Any comments from the town manager?
To be honest, I could work with 10% without, and then remove potential, those games, if you will, or how to bend the edges of the rules. If we clean that language up and had it as a hard number, I think you could live with that over time, because it'll grow. And as you can see on the list, you know, I think you could accommodate.
Are you suggesting 10% for both capital and maintenance?
Yeah, I think you could live with both on that. Yeah.
Okay. Can we ask the town attorney
Yes.
to draft a proposal for limitation on capital and maintenance exposure of 10% of the annual budget?
So that's what I would ask. Do we want to say like all funds or general fund? I mean, I would probably suggest you do total, including the enterprise, because then you could bite off something bigger in the water sewer side of things. So that would.
I defer. Whatever the language is that gives us the flexibility that's within the 10%.
Yeah, I think Matt could give some language to Glenn to what those words would be that we kind of report through to trim use trim terminology in that, I think would help hold it together.
We have question, when you talk about an enterprise fund, what is that for? Because enterprise fund is a self-supporting. You get revenues and you spend on that.
Yeah, so our general fund budget's about 12 million. Let's just,
The recommended number for 2022 is about 13.1.
yeah, so 13.1, and then you have another 7, 8 million in your enterprise funds, which is water, sewer, and building department. Yeah, building department's limited revenue or limited,
It's not actually an enterprise fund, it's a special revenue fund.
special revenue
where
fund. Yeah.
The revenue can only be used for that specific purpose.
So yeah, we're about 21
21, 22.
million.
So in this case, I would suggest that 10% of general fund.
The general fund, so of about 13.1, so it'd be 1.3 million at any, okay,
Is that enough?
sure.
Well, I
Well,
guess the
anything's better. I
question
mean, I'm
is,
grasping at
it's
straws.
always
I mean,
better.
really,
I
that's
guess
true.
the question is, could we have some alternative language of the general fund or all funds? Matt, I'll defer to you in terms of what that should be. The second part,
I have a feeling that when you start getting to 10% of all funds, then you're talking about a number that's probably in the vicinity of,
2 million.
instead of being 1.1, it's probably nearly double that.
okay.
And
I
that might
guess-
be a number that
Do that.
many view as way too large for any individual.
It is a
That's
big
side
jump.
note.
I guess my point is that at least we can list it and consider it. And if we accept it, we accept it. What I'm trying to address is that we don't have a full cohort here to talk through. And I just want to make sure that we have adequate discussion of what those numbers are, whether we wind up at the 10% of the annual or not, is to just generate a discussion of both for the full cohort before we make a decision.
I have no objection to doing that, but I think that it's fine to like look at it as an alternative. I'd be extremely uncomfortable going there. I think you'd be increasing the current 350,000, which we've all agreed is not adequate, to about 1.3 million if we did the general fund, and about 2.2 million or whatever it would come out to otherwise, which I think a 700% increase would be a little bit tough for everybody to swallow.
And
Since
I
it's
have
for
no
each-
disagreement.
Since it's for each line item.
Yeah. I have no disagreement with that. I just want to show
That's fine.
what we've considered. Glenn,
Whenever you're finished, I just wanted to.
go ahead.
So I'm hearing the 10% of general fund, then the other alternative. And I also heard capital or maintenance. So does that mean you want to take out that language that's concerning about the slippery slope and any single project or accumulation of projects or extension of town services? Take that out and replace it with the words, any capital or maintenance expenditure in any given fiscal year? Is that the simple way to put it? Because I agree with you. When you talk about things like extension of services or single project or accumulation of project, are they 10 pocket parks? Is that one project or is that 10 projects? So were you also talking about eliminating those kind of ambiguous words?
Can we draft both alternatives? Do I have a motion to accept that Glenn will draft both alternatives in terms of expenditure and taking out the, I'll call it the wishy-washy language,
Thank you.
or leaving it in so that we can look at appropriate language for this board? Motion? You want to move?
Can you repeat? When you summarize it, it seems that you have a clear idea about the motion. Can you propose a motion? And I second it.
I'm going to propose that there be a motion to address the 10% limitation on expenditures as being from one of two sources, either the general budget or the total enterprise fund first. And second, whether we can have the language in terms of what defines a project as it currently exists, or Glenn, using your language, proposal of for
Capital and maintenance.
capital or
expenditures.
maintenance expenditures with no
No wishy.
additional description. That's the motion.
Good, I second it.
So just for clarification, Vice Chairperson Rosen, you made the first motion and Board Member Ty made the second motion.
I think
Uh,
he seconded her motion.
Yes, he
Technically-
seconded the motion. Just
Yeah.
one. Okay, thank you.
Does that work? Okay. So moving on to 3.021, which is the payment of debts and who's signing. We had general agreement at the last meeting that the town manager and the finance director would have signing authority. But we wanted to consider a cap on that signing authority where I guess it would be a dual signature provision where some member of the commission would have to approve above a level. And I believe that we were talking about $100,000 because that's what it says in our notes from our last meeting. Do we have any thoughts on whether we want that signing authority to be dual signature and at what level? And then can we draft the proposal for consideration at the next meeting?
I think we were coming around to just have the staff sign and the commission didn't have to do it without limitation by the end of the last discussion, and I would certainly go along with that. We can present it to the full group as an option, certainly, as is, either just let town manager and finance official do it versus have a secondary signature from a member of the commission. We can leave that as a choice for the group, but I think we were coming around to just the not requiring a commission or mayor's signature.
Yeah, I would like to ask Marshall, normally you sign the check or finance director sign it, or both?
Sorry, what
You
was that?
sign the check or finance director sign it, or both of you sign it?
Oh, I would always say we would both sign it. The concern was when we had to get a commissioner in at all times, it kind of slows and bogs down the process.
Yeah.
We're getting through, we're living, we're succeeding, but it would just be quicker and more efficient to do that because all of our systems are predicated on an audit trail now with our new financial system and the purchasing policy, and the item has to be budgeted. So the commission approves the budget, everything that they're allowed to spend their money on. You have to buy it through the purchasing policy, which sets how we get quotes when commission approval of a contract even to do it is. So, needing a threshold is correct. You probably don't because there's all these other protections built into the system already. But
So in this case, I would like to make a motion. That I would like to see checks shall be signed by finance director and town manager. Can you help draft that one, please?
I'll second it.
Watch TV. Put your ears in.
Any approval of that motion? Aye. Any opposed? So moved.
okay.
All right. Moving on to 3.05, the salaries of the commissioners and the mayor.
So what I said, I apologize, I'll jump in. I took the language that's currently in there. We would just have to propose that language again.
Okay.
Because it's already in there. We just didn't get voter approval of it. It was changed by an incorrect method. So we just have to restate, if the language is already drafted, we just have to agree to put it forward to the voters to receive that message, unless, of course, you all want to change it.
Yeah, I would take that one back a step, actually. I looked at a bunch of town charters from surrounding areas. And while all of them start with the commission voting for their salaries, most of the towns require some other form of approval or some limitation rather than just the commission being able to raise their salaries. So one of the things that we used in several places was the commission could set salaries, but the increase didn't go into effect until the commissioners who had voted for that change had been reelected or were no longer present, one or the other. So in other words, you couldn't vote to increase your own salary during your current term of office. That was one. They did that in, I think it was, I don't know, there were a couple of places that did that. And then in one place, I think Tequesta, they actually required changes in commission salary to go to a referendum, which I would not be in favor of. But I think that this idea that I think what may have been broached at one point previously, that yes, they can vote to increase their salaries, but it doesn't go into, in other words, they can't increase their own personal salary unless they get reelected, which gives the voters a chance to opine in a sense as to whether that was a reasonable thing that they did or not. So that would be, as long as we're drafting alternatives, I would consider making that change as opposed to leaving it, the commission can just set their own salaries.
Yeah, I concur with you. I suggest that we can make a motion that if they increase salary based on the inflation, annual inflation index, that's fine. But if there is a kind of decision to make their salary increase beyond, above the inflation percentage, their salary increase should go to the voters.
Well, I'm actually not in favor of people increasing their salaries automatically based on an inflation index either. I'm old, but we've had periods in our not that distant history where inflation rates in 79 and 80 were around up to size 13.5%, whereas the growth in the economy was around 2% or 3%. So you can get into big discordances in that, and I'm not necessarily in favor of having, particularly when it comes up for review every 10 years, having automatic salary increases based on inflationary rates. But
I just have one practical question. With the staggered election of our commissioners, are you saying that we'd have to have a full turn of the reelection of the commissioners before any salary increase would go into effect?
I don't know that I'm necessarily advocating anything specific, but I'm just bringing that up as alternative. Yes, one way to do it would be that it would become staggered, so they wouldn't all have the same salary necessarily at the same time, although there are only 5 of them, so I don't think from a bookkeeping standpoint, it would be too hard to keep track of it. And then so yes, that would be a possibility. The other possibility that I've seen is that it's just until the next election cycle. So some people in a sense would get the benefit from it, but not immediately. So either one of those are something that I just think we should look at. I just think that the likelihood of it being abused is really tiny. But there's theoretically nothing in there that says that they can't increase their salaries to, $300,000 a year starting next week. And then it would have to go for 2 readings. And there's people, there might be a revolt in the meantime, but in terms of the charter, that would be an acceptable thing. And again, I think the charter should be something that, when possible, looks at, downside possibilities as well as an affirmative framework. And anyway, it's more unique, at least from the handful of towns that I looked at, for it to be done like this than without some sort of limitations. I don't know what Glenn or Matt's experience has been.
Yeah, may I add to this one, actually, when we get the social security benefits, checks, those who are working, you have not yet. But social security, benefits increase based on the annual inflation rate determined by GSA, federal government. And I don't know whether you have received any year, so your social security benefits, social security benefits increase more than 5%. I doubt it because of the inflation rate worked by the GSA, General Service Administration, is based on the consumer packet. Therefore, always very low compared with the 50%. I never heard of the 50% increase.
If you
in
go look in
inflation rate.
79, 80, during the end of the Carter administration, the inflation rates were 13.5%. Building loan rates, because we happen to be building an office building that then, were roughly 20% per annum back then.
Couldn't get a mortgage for under 18.
And then in the mid 70s, around the time of the gas crisis in 73, 74, again, if you go look, inflation rates weren't that high, but they were, I forget, 9% or something like that. So we've had a sustained period of low inflation now for a long time, which is great. But that's not like a guarantee. These things cycle. If you're around long enough, it cycles. So.
Yeah, actually, my point is that to avoid a kind of voter, approval when the commission increases their salary, even if 3% or 2%, I would like to set up kind of a limit on that one, so that more than certain level go to the voters, because I don't want to see voters cast the vote on many issues.
I don't have any other comment really. I mean, I bring this up because in perusing other towns and how they did it, it was not a carte blanche kind of a setup. It does not appeal to me to have salary increases go to referendum. That just seemed way too cumbersome to me. But possibly tying it into, yes, people in Congress do it all the time. They raise their own, their benefits and their salaries and so on. But this seems like some sort of a compromise where, yes, you could raise commission, the commission could raise salaries, but the benefits didn't accrue to those people that were voting for it unless they'd been reelected, basically. So it's just a suggestion. Their salaries are not a major part of the budget. No matter how you slice it, it's always going to be a rounding error in the total budget, whatever the total commission salaries are. But again, we're reviewing the charter. It was just something when I looked at it, I said, oh, I don't know about this. Maybe we should look at it.
Yeah, you raise a good question.
So that's all.
You raise a good question because of many cases.
Not a deal breaker in any direction.
Comment from the town attorney?
One thing what Doc's talking about is some towns where you have Commissioner Jones elected in 2021 and they passed an ordinance in 2022 that raises their salaries. Commissioner Jones's wouldn't be in effect until 2024. And Commissioner Smith until 2025. So when each person stands for election again, that's when, so you might have an uneven salary structure at some point when, is that, Doc, just want to make sure I'm on the same page when we write this up.
I don't have a problem with that. I mean, it evens up eventually. I mean, not everybody in every job is paid the same salary. Salaries change with seniority and this and that. So again, I don't feel strongly about it. And I don't want to waste the group's too much time, but it just, in looking at it, seemed like it was a little bit and looking into it a little bit, it seemed a little bit unusual the way we currently do it. I mean, as far as I know, there've been no abuses. They hadn't received a raise, I think, in 17 years or 13 years or some long period of time. So I don't think it's something that's likely to ever be, abused, but it's an alternative suggestion, that's all.
I just think from an election statement, I agree that there should be some limitation on salary decisions. But I think staggering the effective date based on somebody's entrance into their position, that would mean that their successor, if they don't run for reelection, would be making less. That might force somebody to wait to knock somebody else out. So I would suggest maybe a compromise that if the commissioners vote for a salary increase, that it goes into effect after the next general election or commissioner's election.
I think the way it would work though with this system is if you passed a salary increase, you wouldn't get it unless you were reelected, but the person who took your place would get the salary increase because they didn't vote for it. So they would get the salary increase. They wouldn't get your salary, they would get the increased salary. You follow what I mean? I mean, the idea is you couldn't raise your own salary without facing the voters again. If you replace, then that person gets the increased salary. At least that's how I understood the wording when I read it elsewhere. But it would be possible that people at different times might have different salaries.
Is there a motion for the town attorney to draft a proposal on the limitation of the effective date of any salary increase voted on by the commissioners for themselves, such that it doesn't take effect until the beginning of a subsequent term for that commissioner?
Yeah, since I've used up enough of our time, I will make that motion.
Second? So moved. Okay. We are up to the fire department. The issues were where to add the reference to the forthcoming fire chief, in which sections that would go into.
If you want to add them to it, correct.
And at the last meeting, we didn't reach any conclusion, as I recall.
I would suggest that we, in the charter, there is a section on finance director, on sheriff, and for this projected, department, I think the charter should have something about the fire department.
So just to clarify, well, there is a section now we've approved through second read, the authorization of the ordinance establishing the fire department. So we can establish the fire department. Again, the concern would be the hire and discharge capabilities of the town manager for staff that reports to them and relegating those two distinct activities to the commission only. That's kind of where it is. And I mean, it's a tough one. It's a tough one to hear for some. It's a tough discussion. I don't know. I've tried to reflect on it more and more. It's almost either you do it or you don't kind of concept. I guess my gut would tell me to move away from it, whether you grandfather the two existing individuals because they were in place before something like this would go in. Again, the voters could still say no. As we move to that full service model, we do everything for the most part. I mean, there's probably a few extra services communities, but we're going to be a full service city, if you will. And to have 2, 3, who knows where basically you have 3 people that are in positions critical to the success of the organization, that truly the town manager doesn't have authority over those individuals. As much as you can say, oh, you can manage the individual, you really can if you don't have the ability to, one, retain their services. I guess I'm not even concerned about that. You could say the commission can appoint, but still then it'd be tough for the commission because then makes it ripe for politics, unfortunately, especially as we got bigger. I mean, as a small town, picking out a few key spots is good. But I think as we grow and move forward, I think you kind of have to fully embrace the manager council form of government and allow that to play out. Whether you grandfather the existing ones, it makes sense because they came in under a certain arrangement. But moving forward, I think, you kind of have to move away from that a little bit.
So as I understand that, we're talking about what I'll call the strong town manager model, and saying that all positions report to the town manager, and the commission's remedy, if you will, is to deal with the town manager, with the exception that we would grandfather in those people who are in those positions today, who have the understanding that they are not reporting to the town manager, sort of.
Well,
But I guess the question from a drafting standpoint for this board is whether to adopt what I'll call the strong manager position, to say that all functions will report to the town manager, subject to the present status of the two existing personnel who do not, until such time as they are not employed by the town.
Yeah, I may. Actually, I already thought of that, and I plan to have a motion, on that kind of organizational structure. I don't feel comfortable that, some department heads bypass the town manager. We have to have any kind of uniform treatment. That means all departments head should go through town manager. Why? Because town manager is a full-time person. And commissions are part-time. They don't know much. And if we give some specific treatment to some chief, some head of the departments, there will come to, there may occur the situation that conflicts between the town manager and that department head. I would like to have a kind of uniform structure. Here, you have to report to town manager. And everything, town manager should, have the kind of, has the kind of authority with some kind of limitation. So in this case, for the new fire department, I would like to have a job description for the fire responsibility, like a sheriff's police office, police chief. At the same time, under the decision of hiring, suspension, etc., we treat them under another category in the charter. That means every department head, can be fired, can be suspended by the town manager upon approval of the commission or something like that. I would like to discuss that kind of organization structure later on.
If I could just,
I think,
if I could just quickly clarify, if you choose to do nothing, it stays with the police chief and the clerk being direct appointees of the commission, because the way the fire ordinance was adopted, I appoint the fire chief. That's the way it's currently on the books today. So if you said, maybe it's not time to make this change yet, let's see how this rolls out, leave us to the next charter committee, that's how it would look, is that the police chief, the clerk would still have the hire and discharge authority would rest with the commission, but the fire chief, if we were to move forward unchanged, is an appointee of the town manager.
I think this one we're actually in agreement, so that's a nice thing. I'm in favor of all the department heads reporting to the town manager, which would ultimately include the police chief and the town clerk. I mean, to make documents clean, I would consider doing that right away, but in a personal sense, I think that's somewhat unfair to the people that were already here, who were hired under certain rules. So if it's kosher to do so and we can grandfather people, I would grandfather the current town clerk and police chief. But when their individual service is completed, then those departments would also revert to the town manager. And I agree. I mean, our town manager is a professional. The commission are well-meaning folks who do a good job, but do it as a part-time. And I think the responsibility should lie with the town manager, and it would be a fool of a town manager who didn't involve the commission in some way in both the hiring and the firing of people as important as a police chief, town clerk, or fire chief. But from a charter standpoint, I think that the reporting responsibilities and hiring, firing responsibilities should be under the town manager.
With that said, and hearing some agreement, I propose a motion for the drafting of a provision for all positions to report to the town manager, with the caveat, subject to, Glenn, I'll leave it to you, the grandfathering of the present positions of the clerk and the police chief reporting to the commission, but that such positions would ultimately report to the town manager thereafter.
Can I make a comment?
Or Ron,
Hello?
we're ready.
I'm in agreement with the basic proposal, but I still believe that the current, I was in many positions in my career where I was hired under one set of circumstances. If you're in business, that happens all the time. And then suddenly you now report into a new structure and so forth. So, I mean, I can appreciate the fact that the police chief and anyone else that, you know, may have a current position. But I don't see any reason why everyone can't report to the town manager immediately. I don't see any reason why it can't be changed along with the future.
With that said, Ron, would you agree with a motion to draft it both ways, with the grandfathering in of the present positions and then without?
Yes.
Anybody want to make that motion?
So moved.
I'll make the motion.
Can you repeat?
Second?
Yeah, second.
It's-
All right, I think that's the end of the provisions that we were supposed to discuss on our agenda today as unfinished business. With that in mind, is there any new business to be discussed by this board?
So our next meeting is July 9th,
Yes,
at which
sir.
point Mr. Torsivia, who I love giving all this assignments to, well, it really does fall to you anyway.
July
It's all
12th.
legal language. So
July 12th.
is it July 12th?
3 extra days.
July
Oh,
12th.
nice.
July 12th, right, so I was looking at that too, thinking, okay, I got a little more time. There's some of them, for example, the last one you did, there's 3 different sections in the charter. We have to make little
right.
changes to accomplish that. So, and July 12th is wonderful.
Perfect.
Any other new business?
I just had questions about future meeting schedules and how we're going to accomplish what we're doing and reasonable time frame, and what is our time frame of getting, in other words, we need a draft, we need to look at that, then we should probably, you know, at least make a temporary vote on that, then maybe have another meeting, sort of the second reading, to have a final vote on that, and hopefully in between we'll actually
That's
elicit some public comment, which has been, you know, noticeably absent from our deliberations.
So that's a good question. So actually, Barry Donaldson had sent me stuff. He couldn't be with us. He had some emergency family issues he had to take care of, but he suggested that, let me see, right on point. So I'll share his comments, because if I don't, he'll be upset with me, I'm sure. Let me see the relating language. It says, per my comments at last meeting, I remain okay. It says, some convincing arguments. The process. So basically take formal actions of items no longer. We took care of that, arrive at a more refined consensus, which we did, and then take up any room. Okay. To that degree, we'll be able to guide the board in the direction I appreciate. The next meeting, my goal was to hold a formal vote on those, which we're coming back to. Once we take that, Barry was indicating that he's interested in taking on the responsibility of formalizing that into a report of some fashion that then would be the final vote of the entire. So you got 2 or 3 more meetings conceivably under an ideal scenario. So that'd be the 12th. What's the one after the 12th, Linelda?
July 19th.
12th, the 19th, and then what's after that? If we need
That's-
more, you can take more. Because I think you have until mid-August,
Yeah,
but mid to late August was the initial. But again, if you need more time because there's more debate, because I think the commission could recognize additional time.
Yeah, I think that, Barry's idea, certainly having a cover letter or whatever, a report is, to maybe summarize some of the discussions and options that we had is fine for public consumption or for the commission. I mean, the final product of this group is actually a draft of the
Recommended.
charter
Mhm.
that includes the recommended changes and, a red line copy presumably. And then there can be a cover letter that dictates
Well,
points of
there needs to
discussion,
be
perhaps.
notes to
Yeah.
describe what's in the red line is the way that I
Yes,
think that
right.
works, rather than, and I think that that should be read and approved by all members of this board before that goes. So I would think that we probably need at least one more meeting scheduled that post the 19th. Assuming that we can get through the language on the 12th, would allow us then to finalize on the 19th and then do the notes at that last subsequent meeting.
Yeah, I would hope that we'd have enough people here at the next meeting that, I know Ron will be back. Hopefully, everybody will be here. That we can take whatever votes we need. And the following time, get a draft to look at and then either approve that or make some last minute changes in that and be on our way. And then if there's going to be additional explanatory cover letter, commentaries, whatever, that's something that we as a group should look at as well.
Yeah, I will ask you a question. I sent to the town clerk quite a few suggestions, comments, and proposed suggested motions. Should my suggestion, I sent her about 6 pages. Should those pages be sent to you for review before the meeting?
I think, obviously any comments that you share in writing with Linelda or Marshall should go to the whole group to look at, I guess.
Yeah,
I
so
think we're doing that.
We'll do an
I was just gonna
appendix
say,
to
are
the
these-
end.
Didn't we send those?
Yeah, so at the end of it, when you do your final report, we'll put an appendices of all support documents or comments, emails, so it's a full public record of your discussion. So if you get mad at me, don't email and call me. But no, so at the end of the report, you'll have all of those support documents that kind of show that natural progression of thought and discussion.
But can we send, my suggestion to you before the next meeting? So
You gotta
that you can consider?
Send it to Linelda. Linelda will
Yeah.
then distribute it out to the group.
Yeah, I already.
Okay.
I would like to save some time and then I move on and we finish it. Too many meetings.
With,
Thank you.
with that said, is there any other new business to discuss? Motion for adjournment?
So moved.
Yes, one more.
We are adjourned.